The alarm clock buzzed, a harsh, cheap sound in the quiet darkness of the small room. It was 5 a.m. The man in the bed moved without hesitation, his hand finding the button by touch alone. He had been awake for a few minutes already, listening to the deep silence of the big house. This was his time, the only part of the day that truly felt like his own. His name was Arthur, and he was the live-in caretaker for a very wealthy man. He swung his legs out of bed, the floor cool beneath his feet. He didn't need to turn on a light. He knew this room perfectly. It was simple, with a bed, a small wardrobe, and a single chair. It was more than enough for him. The main house was a different world. As he stepped out of his quarters and into the kitchen, his movements were quiet and practiced. He filled the kettle, the sound of the water like a small explosion in the stillness. While he waited for it to boil, he stood by the massive window, looking out at the shapes of the garden in the pre-dawn light. He remembered a time, years ago, when his own small kitchen would be filled with the morning chaos of his son getting ready for school. Those days were long gone now, replaced by this peaceful, predictable routine. He made 1 cup of tea, steeping the bag just long enough, no milk, 1 sugar. He held the warm mug in both hands, letting the heat seep into his fingers. This was his ritual. For these 10 minutes, he was just a man drinking his tea, not an employee. At 5:30 a.m., his work began. He took the feather duster from its cupboard and started his rounds. The house was what people called minimalist. That meant there were very few things lying around. There were large, angular sofas that looked more like sculptures than something you would sit on. There were tables made of a single piece of polished, dark wood. And there was art on the walls, just splashes of color and shape that he didn't understand, but he knew they were expensive. His job was to keep it all perfect. He ran the duster over every surface, every day. He didn't just wipe away the dust. He banished it. He took a strange pride in this. In a world where so much was messy and complicated, here, in this house, he could create order. The owner of the house was a man named Mr. Croft. Arthur rarely saw him. Mr. Croft was a ghost in his own home, a presence felt but not seen. He lived mostly in the West Wing, in his office and private rooms. Arthur was not allowed to enter the office until exactly 1 p.m. for a light cleaning, and only if Mr. Croft was not inside. Their communication happened through notes left on the kitchen island. The notes were always brief. Floor in the hallway needs attention. The plants in the solarium are looking dry. They were never signed, and they were never polite, but they were never rude either. They were just instructions. Arthur was fine with that. He wasn't here to make a friend. He was here to do a job, to earn a steady paycheck, and to have a roof over his head. He had learned, over a difficult life, that simplicity was a kind of wealth. This particular morning felt like any other. After dusting, he got out the special cleaner for the glass tables and the floor polish for the dark wood floors. The house began to smell of lemons and beeswax. He moved from room to room, a silent figure restoring shine to a world that already seemed impossibly shiny as he worked. His mind would sometimes wander. He wondered what Mr. Croft did all day in that office. He knew he was in the tech world, something to do with computers and the internet. Arthur's own knowledge of such things was limited to the small, simple phone he used to call his son on Sundays. He imagined Mr. Croft staring at multiple computer screens, numbers and codes flying past, making decisions worth more money than Arthur would see in his lifetime. Around 11 a.m., he was in the hallway that ran past the closed door of Mr. Croft's office. He was unpacking the vacuum cleaner when he heard it. It was a low, muffled sound at first, like a man trying to swallow a shout. Arthur paused, his hand on the vacuum cord. He listened. There was only silence. He shrugged and plugged in the machine. Just as he was about to turn it on, another sound came from the office. This one was not muffled. It was a raw, guttural scream of pure frustration, a sound that seemed to tear itself from a person's throat. It was followed immediately by a heavy, crashing thud, as if something large and solid had been thrown against a wall with tremendous force. Arthur froze. The sound was so violent, so full of despair, that it felt like a physical blow. His heart started to beat a little faster. He stared at the sleek, dark wood of the office door, half expecting it to splinter. His first feeling was one of alarm. Was Mr. Croft hurt? Had something happened? His instinct was to knock, to ask if everything was okay. He took a half step towards the door, his hand lifting. But then he stopped. He remembered the man's demeanor on the few occasions he had seen him. Mr. Croft was tall, with a sharp, intense face that always seemed to be focused on something 1,000 miles away. His eyes would flick over Arthur as if he were just another piece of furniture. His voice, when he had once told Arthur to reschedule his cleaning, was clipped and dismissive. He was a man who valued his privacy above all else, a man who clearly did not want to be bothered. Knocking on that door now felt like a terrible intrusion. It would be embarrassing for both of them. What would he even say? "I heard you screaming and throwing things?" It was none of his business. He stood there in the hallway, torn. A thought formed in his mind, clear and simple. This is wrong. It wasn't just the noise that was wrong. It was the feeling behind it. This wasn't the anger of a rich man who didn't get his way. This was the sound of a person breaking. Arthur had heard that sound before, in his own life, in moments of overwhelming pressure and loss. He knew what it meant. He made his decision. He would not knock. He would not interfere. But he also couldn't just pretend he hadn't heard it. The peaceful rhythm of his day was shattered. Slowly, he bent down and unplugged the vacuum cleaner. He wouldn't be vacuuming this hallway now. The noise would feel disrespectful. He coiled the cord neatly and put the machine back in its closet. The house was silent again, but the silence was different now. It was heavy and tense, like the air before a storm. For the rest of the morning, as he went about his other tasks, Arthur felt unsettled. As he polished the banister of the grand staircase, his mind kept returning to the sound of that crash. As he carefully wiped the leaves of the large fiddle-leaf fig tree in the living room, he pictured the look of utter despair that must have been on Mr. Croft's face. He thought about the notes on the kitchen island. He thought about the empty, silent meals Mr. Croft must eat alone. He thought about the immense pressure of managing so much money, of being responsible for so many people he had never even met. For the first time, Arthur didn't see his employer as just a wealthy, distant figure. He saw him as a man who was clearly drowning in some private ocean of stress. When the clock finally ticked towards 1 p.m., Arthur felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach. His scheduled cleaning of the office was here. He walked slowly to the kitchen and washed his hands, drying them carefully on a towel. He approached the office door and took a deep breath. He knocked softly 3 times. There was no answer. He waited, knocked again a little louder. Still, only silence. Cautiously, he turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was a disaster. It looked like a storm had hit it. Papers were scattered everywhere. A large, expensive-looking monitor was lying face down on the floor, its screen a spiderweb of cracks. A chair was overturned. In the corner, a ceramic lamp was in pieces. The air smelled of stale coffee and cold pizza. And there, in the middle of the chaos, sitting on the floor with his back against a bookshelf, was Mr. Croft. He was asleep or passed out from exhaustion. His face was pale, and even in sleep, he looked tense. His brow furrowed. Arthur stood in the doorway, his heart aching with a sudden, unexpected pity. He looked at the man, then at the wreckage of the room. He knew then that his first thought had been right. This was more than just a bad day. Something was very, very wrong. And as he stood there, the quiet man with the feather duster, he felt a responsibility to do something. He just didn't know what. The silence in the house the next morning felt heavier than usual. When Arthur woke up at 5, the darkness outside his window seemed to press in a little more. His usual cup of tea didn't taste the same. His mind kept drifting back to the image of the shattered monitor and the man asleep on the floor amidst the wreckage of his own office. His work that morning was mechanical. He dusted the same surfaces, polished the same floors, but his heart wasn't in it. The order he was creating felt fragile, like a thin layer of ice over deep, troubled water. He found himself listening, his ears straining for any sound from the West Wing. But there was nothing, just an unnerving, complete silence. Exactly 1 p.m. He walked to the office door, his cleaning caddy feeling heavier than normal. He knocked softly. To his surprise, a voice from inside said, "Come in." The door opened into a different scene from the day before, but not a better one. The broken monitor and the shattered lamp were gone. The chair was upright, but the room was far from clean. It was a landscape of slow decay. Empty coffee mugs, some with a crust of dried scum, were scattered on every surface. The sleek metal trash bin was overflowing with crumpled papers and empty food containers. A faint, sour smell hung in the air. Croft was at his desk, his back to the door. He was on the phone, and his voice was a low, tense whisper. "No, you don't understand. The data is corrupted. The entire model it's unsalvageable. We can't go to the board with this." Arthur moved quietly, trying to be invisible. He started by carefully collecting the mugs, holding them by their handles to avoid the sticky residue. "Don't tell me to calm down." Mr. Croft's whisper suddenly sharpened, though he kept his volume low. "This isn't a glitch. This is a $500 million failure." The number was so big, so abstract, it didn't even feel real to Arthur. It was like hearing about the distance to a star. But the pain in the man's voice was very real. Arthur focused on a coffee stain on the glass desk, scrubbing at it with a cloth. "I don't care what the investors expect," Mr. Croft hissed. "They expect a miracle? I don't have one." He fell silent, listening to the person on the other end. His shoulders, tense and high, seemed to slump in defeat. "Just buy me a day. Tell them I'm sick. Tell them anything." He ended the call and threw the phone onto the desk with a clatter. He didn't turn around. He just put his head in his hands, his fingers digging into his hair. Arthur froze, holding a stack of dirty mugs, not daring to move or make a sound. After a long moment, Mr. Croft let out a long, shaky breath, a sound of pure exhaustion. Then he stood up abruptly and walked out of the office without a single glance in Arthur's direction. Arthur was left alone in the quiet room. The air still vibrated with the man's panic. He finished gathering the mugs and tackled the overflowing trash. As he pulled the bag out, a single piece of paper, weighted down by a mug, fluttered into view. It was a financial statement. Arthur wasn't trying to look, but his eyes couldn't help but see the numbers printed there in stark black ink. There was a figure with so many zeros it took him a moment to count them. And next to it, a graph. Most of the graph was a tall, proud green bar, but on the far right it plunged down into a deep, alarming red, like a cliff edge. He quickly looked away, his face feeling warm as if he'd been caught doing something wrong. He wasn't a businessman. He didn't understand algorithms or financial models. But he understood that graph. He had seen a similar look on his own bank statements years ago, when things were bad, when every falling number meant a real, tangible loss. A bill he couldn't pay, a repair he couldn't afford. For Mr. Croft, the numbers were astronomically bigger, but the feeling, Arthur suspected, was exactly the same. That cold, tight fear in your stomach. The feeling of the ground crumbling beneath your feet. He finished cleaning the room as best he could. He wiped the surfaces, straightened the pens, and swept the floor. But he couldn't sweep away the feeling of dread that filled the space. The room was clean, but it was not peaceful. Over the next week, a pattern emerged. The angry outbursts from the first day were gone, replaced by this heavy, silent despair. Mr. Croft became a ghost again, but a different kind of ghost. He was paler, thinner. The dark circles under his eyes looked like bruises. Arthur would sometimes pass him in the hallway, and the man would look right through him, his eyes hollow and unfocused. The notes on the kitchen island stopped completely. One afternoon, Arthur was watering the delicate orchids in the glass-walled solarium. The sun was streaming in, warming the air. The flowers were a splash of brilliant purple and white, a small pocket of perfect beauty in the big, cold house. He saw Mr. Croft standing by the main window in the living room, not moving. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't pacing. He was just standing there, perfectly still, staring out at the perfect green lawn and the tall trees that lined the property. But he wasn't really seeing any of it. His expression made Arthur's blood run cold. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was a complete and total emptiness. It was the look of a man who had given up. It was a look Arthur had seen before in a mirror a long time ago during the worst period of his own life. It was a look that said, "I have nothing left." Arthur finished watering the plants, his hands trembling slightly. The knot of worry in his stomach, which had been there for days, tightened into a hard ball of fear. This was more than just business trouble. This was a human being in deep, deep trouble. Cleaning the mugs and taking out the trash wasn't enough. It was like putting a bandage on a deep, internal wound that he thought about his son, far away. He thought about what he would want someone to do if it were his son who was lost in such a dark place, surrounded by wealth but feeling completely alone. Later, when he entered the office for his 1 p.m. cleaning, the room was empty again. It was in its usual state of disarray. But today, Arthur looked at it differently. He saw the chaos not as a mess, but as a cry for help. The empty mugs were a sign that the man wasn't sleeping, living on caffeine and stress. The crumpled papers were the physical evidence of his failing dreams, that he did his normal duties. But his mind was working, thinking. What could he do? He couldn't give business advice. He couldn't fix a broken computer program. He was just a cleaning man. But he was a person. And sometimes, a person needed another person to see them, to acknowledge their pain in a simple, human way. He finished wiping the large desk, clearing a space in the middle of the chaos. He looked at that clean, empty space, and an idea, small and simple, began to form. It was a risk. It might be ignored. It might even make Mr. Croft angry. But doing nothing felt worse. He left the office and walked to the kitchen. He took one of the clean, white mugs from the cupboard. He chose a tea bag, a calming chamomile, and placed it in the mug. Then he saw the small jar of golden honey on the counter. He placed it next to the mug. He found a pad of sticky notes and a pen. He stood there for a moment, thinking, what could he write? I hope you feel better? That was too personal. Don't give up. That was too presumptuous. He thought about the look on the man's face as he stared out the window, blind to the world. He thought about the orchids in the solarium, blooming so beautifully in the sunshine. Completely unaware of the turmoil inside the house, he put the pen to the paper and wrote, in his careful, clear handwriting, a simple sentence. He didn't sign it. He peeled the note off the pad and stuck it neatly on the counter next to the mug and the honey. Then, holding the small arrangement, he walked back to the office. His heart was beating a little fast. He placed the mug, the honey, and the note right in the center of the clean space he had made on the desk. It looked like a small island of peace in a sea of chaos. He stood back and looked at it. Seemed so small, so foolish. A mug and a note against a $500 million problem. He felt a flush of embarrassment. What was he thinking? He gathered his cleaning supplies and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. He had no idea if his small, simple gesture would mean anything at all. He just knew that when he saw someone drowning, you had to throw them a line, no matter how small it seemed. And for now, this was the only line he had. The rest of the day passed with a strange, slow tension for Arthur. He finished his chores, but his mind was back in that office, on that simple white mug sitting on the big desk. A part of him felt foolish. What was a cup of tea going to do against such a huge problem? The man was dealing with millions of dollars. He probably wouldn't even notice it. Or worse, he would see it as an intrusion, an act of disrespect from the hired help. Maybe he would be angry. Maybe Arthur would find a note on the kitchen island tomorrow telling him his services were no longer required. That evening, he ate his simple dinner alone in his small quarters, the silence feeling heavier than ever. He tried to watch a little television, but he couldn't focus on the shows. He kept imagining Mr. Croft walking back into his office, seeing the mug, and scowling, crumpling the note in his fist. Arthur went to bed early, but sleep was slow to come. The next morning, he woke up with a sense of dread. His routine felt different. The tea didn't taste as good. The dusting felt pointless. He was waiting for the other shoe to drop. He half expected Mr. Croft to storm out of his wing at any moment. But the house remained silent. When 1 p.m. arrived, Arthur approached the office door with a tightness in his chest. He knocked softly. There was no answer. He took a deep breath and opened the door. The room was, as always, a mess. but his eyes went immediately to the desk. The mug was there. The tea bag was still inside, dry and unused. The jar of honey was untouched. But the note was gone. His heart sank. Maybe Mr. Croft had just thrown it away. That was the most likely thing. He tried not to feel disappointed as he began his cleaning. He picked up the mugs, his movements slow. As he reached for the one he had left, he paused. He looked inside. The tea bag was still dry, yes, but the mug wasn't exactly where he had left it. It had been moved a few inches to the side, as if someone had picked it up, looked at it, and then put it back down. And the note was definitely gone. It wasn't much, but it was something. He hadn't used the tea, but he had seen the note. He had read it. For some reason, that small fact made Arthur feel a little better. He cleaned the room and left, the knot in his stomach loosening just a little. The next day, when he entered the office, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. The mug was gone from the desk. For a second, he thought Mr. Croft had finally just put it away. But then he saw it. It was on a small side table near the window, and it was clean. It had been washed. Arthur stood there, looking at the clean, empty mug by the window. It was such a small thing, a tiny detail. But in that house where every object had its place, this was a message. The mug had been acknowledged. It had been touched, moved, and cleaned. It was no longer just a piece of kitchenware. It was part of the room. He didn't leave a new note or tea bag that day. It felt like the moment had passed. But he felt a small spark of hope. The following week, the changes were subtle, but Arthur, a man who noticed every detail, saw them all. The first thing he noticed was the silence. The tense, heavy feeling in the west wing began to lift. It was like a thick fog slowly clearing. The air didn't feel as sharp or as desperate. Then he saw Mr. Croft one morning, quite early. Arthur was polishing the banister in the main hall when the man came out of his bedroom. He was dressed not in rumpled clothes, but in a clean, pressed shirt. He didn't look like a ghost anymore. He looked tired, but present. Their eyes met for a brief second. Arthur quickly looked down, focusing on his polishing cloth. But Mr. Croft didn't just walk past. He paused. "Good morning," the man said. His voice was quiet, a little rough from lack of use, but it was clear. Arthur was so surprised he almost dropped his cloth. He looked up. "Good morning, sir," he replied, his own voice sounding too loud in the big hall. Croft gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and then continued on his way to the kitchen. It was the first time he had ever greeted Arthur. It was nothing, just 2 words. But in that house it felt like a thunderclap. A few days later, Arthur was in the office. The mess was still there, but it was different. It was no longer a mess of panic. It was a mess of work. The papers were in stacks, not scattered. The trash was full, but not overflowing. And on the desk, right in the center, was a single, clean sheet of paper. On it, someone had drawn a rough, simple diagram. It wasn't the complex charts and numbers Arthur had seen before. This was different. It looked like a child's drawing with circles and arrows. It looked simple. Arthur didn't understand it, but he felt it was important. He was careful not to touch it as he dusted around it. The best moment came about 10 days after Arthur had left the note. He was in the solarium checking the soil of the orchids. The afternoon sun was warm on his back. He heard a sound behind him and turned. Croft was standing at the entrance to the room. He wasn't staring blankly. He was looking at the orchids. He was actually seeing them. "They're my mother's," Mr. Croft said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. "The orchids. She loved them." Arthur was so startled he couldn't speak for a moment. He just nodded. Croft took a few steps into the room, his hands in his pockets. He looked at the vibrant purple and white flowers. "I forget to look at them sometimes," he said, more to himself than to Arthur. "I forget they're even here." He stood there for a full minute, just looking. Then he turned and left without another word. Arthur stood by the orchids, his heart feeling full. The man had spoken to him. Not to give an order, not to complain. He had shared a memory. He had acknowledged the beauty in his own house. That evening, As Arthur was preparing to go to his room, he saw Mr. Croft in the living room. He was sitting on one of the large, uncomfortable-looking sofas. He wasn't working. He wasn't on his phone. He was just sitting, looking out the large window at the darkening sky. And for the first time, he didn't look like a man carrying the weight of the world. He just looked like a man, tired after a long day, taking a moment to rest. Arthur went to his room and lay in bed, thinking. The mug had been washed. A good morning had been spoken. The orchids had been seen. A memory had been shared. He thought about the note he had written. The sun is out. The orchids are blooming. It was such a simple, silly thing. But maybe, just maybe, it had reminded a drowning man that there was still a world outside his problems. A world with sun and flowers and clean, quiet moments. He didn't know anything about the $500 million. He didn't know if the business was saved or still failing. But he knew that the man in the big house was changing. The despair was lifting. The darkness was receding. And as Arthur closed his eyes, he felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. He had done his job. He had kept the house clean. But more than that, he had, in his own small way, helped to clean away a little of the sadness. And for a man like him, that felt like a greater achievement than polishing any floor. The change in the house was now as clear as the shine on the polished floors. The heavy, sick feeling was gone, replaced by a kind of busy quiet. Arthur felt it every morning when he woke up. The air itself felt lighter, easier to breathe. Mr. Croft was a different man. He was still busy, still spending long hours in his office, but the frantic, panicked energy had vanished. He was focused now, like a man who finally knew what he had to do. He started leaving the house for meetings, dressed in proper suits. He even started eating proper meals, and Arthur would sometimes find the remains of a real dinner on a plate in the kitchen, not just a takeout container. The good mornings became a regular thing. It was never a long conversation, just a simple greeting, but it made the big house feel less empty. It made Arthur feel less like a ghost and more like a person who lived there. One afternoon, about a month after the whole thing had started with the scream and the broken monitor, Arthur was fixing a loose hinge on a kitchen cabinet. He had a small toolbox for little jobs like this. Mr. Croft came into the kitchen to get a glass of water. He watched Arthur for a moment as he worked the screwdriver. "You're handy with that?" Mr. Croft said. Arthur looked up, a little surprised. "Just small things, sir. My father was a carpenter. He taught me a few things." Mr. Croft nodded slowly, leaning against the counter. He looked thoughtful. "My father was in business. He taught me about numbers and deals." He took a sip of water. "Sometimes, I think fixing something real with your hands must be more satisfying." Arthur didn't know what to say to that, so he just gave a small smile and went back to tightening the screw. It was another small moment, but it felt important. The millionaire and the cleaning man, talking about their fathers. A few weeks later, the weather turned warm. The garden was bursting with color. Arthur decided to do something he hadn't done all spring. He took a cloth and a bucket of soapy water outside to wash the big windows at the back of the house. The sun was warm on his back, and for a while, he lost himself in the simple, satisfying work of making the glass sparkle. He was up on his small ladder, reaching for a high spot, when he heard the office window slide open above him. He froze, not wanting to be a nuisance. But Mr. Croft's voice came out, not angry but curious. "Getting a head start on the spring cleaning?" Arthur looked down from his ladder. "Yes, sir. The sun is perfect for it. No streaks." There was a pause. Then Mr. Croft said, "It looks good." And then the window closed. Arthur stood on his ladder, a slow smile spreading across his face. He felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. It was a feeling of being seen, of his work being appreciated. It was a good feeling. Life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. The crisis seemed to be over. Arthur assumed that Mr. Croft had found a way to fix his business problems. He didn't know how, and he didn't ask. He was just glad the man was no longer suffering. Then, one evening, everything changed. Arthur was in his room, reading a book before bed. There was a soft knock on his door. This was so unusual that for a second, he thought he had imagined it. Then it came again. A little firmer. He got up and opened the door. Mr. Croft was standing there. He was holding 2 glasses and a small bottle of a golden brown liquid. "Can I come in?" he asked. Arthur was so stunned he could only step aside and nod. "Of course, sir." Mr. Croft walked into the small, simple room. He looked around, not with judgment, but with a kind of quiet curiosity. He saw the single photo on the bedside table, a picture of Arthur with his son, taken years ago. "Your boy?" Mr. Croft asked. "Yes, sir," Arthur said, his voice soft. "He's grown now. Lives up north." Mr. Croft nodded. He poured a small amount of the amber liquid into each glass and handed one to Arthur. "I owe you a thanks," he said, his voice serious. Arthur took the glass, confused. "For what, sir?" "For the note," Mr. Croft said. He took a small sip from his glass. "The one about the orchids." Arthur felt his face grow warm. So he had known all along. He had never said a word. "I was in a very dark place," Mr. Croft continued, looking into his glass. "I couldn't see a way out. The project I had bet my entire company on was a failure. A catastrophic failure. I had investors ready to tear me apart. I felt like I was at the bottom of a deep, black hole." He looked up at Arthur. "And then I came back to my desk, and I saw that. A clean mug, a tea bag, a jar of honey, and a note that said, 'The sun is out. The orchids are blooming.'" He paused, letting the words hang in the quiet room. "I read it and I was angry at first. I thought, what does he know? What does any of that matter? But the words stuck in my head. I went to the window and I looked. And you were right. The sun was out. And later I went to the solarium and I saw those flowers. My mother's flowers. And for the first time in a year, I saw something that wasn't a failure. I saw something that was just beautiful. And it was still there. The world was still turning." He took another sip. It broke the spell. It pulled my head up out of the hole, just for a second. And in that second, a stupid, simple idea popped into my head. An idea so basic I had dismissed it years ago. It was the opposite of everything I had been trying to do. It was simple. He looked straight at Arthur, his eyes clear and direct. "We built that idea. We presented it to the board last week. They loved it. It's going to save the company. It's going to save us from losses that would have been enormous. $500 million, maybe more." The number was so vast it was just a sound to Arthur. It didn't feel real. He just stood there, holding his untouched glass. "You saved more than the company," Mr. Croft said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "You pulled me back. I don't know how to thank you for that." Arthur was silent for a long moment. He looked at the wealthy man standing in his simple room. He thought about the scream, the broken monitor, the hollow man staring out the window, and he thought about the clean mug and the little note. "Sir," Arthur said finally, his voice rough with emotion, "you don't have to thank me. I just thought you might need a cup of tea." Mr. Croft looked at him, and for the first time since Arthur had known him, a real, genuine smile spread across his face, transformed him. He looked younger, lighter. He raised his glass. "To the tea, then." Arthur, feeling a little awkward, raised his own glass. They both took a sip. The liquid was strong and burned a little on the way down. Mr. Croft put his glass down on the small table. "Good night, Arthur," he said. "Good night, sir," Arthur replied, and then he was gone, closing the door softly behind him. Arthur stood in the middle of his room for a long time. He looked at the glass in his hand. He looked at the photo of his son. He thought about the $500 million. The number was too big to understand. But the look on Mr. Croft's face when he smiled? That he understood perfectly. He hadn't saved a company. He hadn't saved a fortune. He had simply seen a fellow human being in pain and had offered a small, simple kindness. And that kindness, like a single pebble thrown into a pond, had created ripples he could never have imagined. He finished his drink, the warmth spreading in his chest. Then he got ready for bed, his heart full of a quiet, profound peace. The big house was silent around him, but for the first time, It felt truly, completely, like a home. The morning after the visit, Arthur woke up feeling a sense of calm he hadn't known in years. The world outside his window looked the same, but everything felt different. The weight of the secret was gone. The millionaire knew about the note, and he was not angry. He was grateful. Arthur went about his routine, but there was a new lightness in his step. When he saw Mr. Croft in the hallway, the man gave him a simple nod, just like before. But now Arthur saw the quiet understanding in his eyes. Nothing needed to be said out loud. It was a silent agreement between two men who had shared a difficult moment. Life in the big house settled into a new, comfortable pattern. The notes on the kitchen island never returned. Instead, Mr. Croft would sometimes ask for things directly. "Arthur, could we get someone to look at the gutters?" Or, "The garden is looking wonderful this year." The requests were polite. The tone was respectful. It was no longer just an employer and an employee. It felt more like two people sharing a space, each doing their part. Weeks turned into months. The seasons changed. The lush green of the garden gave way to the fiery reds and golds of autumn. Arthur continued his work, finding a deep joy in the simple, predictable rhythm of his days. He polished the floors, he dusted the art, and he cared for the orchids, which continued to bloom under his watchful eye. One crisp autumn afternoon, Arthur was in the solarium, carefully trimming a few dead leaves from one of the plants. The sun was low in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the room. Mr. Croft came in and stood beside him, watching his careful work. "They've never looked better," Mr. Croft said quietly. "Thank you, sir," Arthur replied. "They're strong plants. They just need a little attention." "They're not the only thing," Mr. Croft said. He paused for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "The company, the new project, it's a success, a big success." Arthur stopped his trimming and looked at him. "I'm very glad to hear that, sir. It's more than just saved," Mr. Croft continued. "It's thriving. We have a future because of that idea. The one I had after." He didn't finish the sentence, just gestured vaguely towards his office. "I wanted you to know. I didn't want it to just be a story you never heard the end of." Arthur nodded, a warm feeling spreading through his chest. He was happy for the man, truly happy. "I know you never did it for a reward," Mr. Croft said, "but I want to do something for you. A bonus, a proper thank you." Arthur shook his head slowly. "Sir, that's not necessary. Really, it's not. My pay is more than fair. I have everything I need right here." Mr. Croft studied his face, looking for any hint that he was not being truthful. He saw only simple, honest sincerity. He nodded, accepting the answer. "All right, but the offer will always stand. If you ever need anything, anything at all, you come to me." "Thank you, sir," Arthur said. "I will." And he knew he meant it. Not for the money, but for the respect behind the offer. That evening, as Arthur sat in his room, he thought about the conversation. He thought about the vast sum of money he had apparently helped save. $500 million. It was an amount he could not even picture. He tried to imagine what he would do with even a tiny fraction of it. A new car? A bigger house? A trip to see his son? But the truth was, he didn't want any of those things. Not really. What he had here was better. He had a purpose. He had a home. He had the quiet respect of a man he had come to admire. He had the deep, satisfying knowledge that he had made a difference in another person's life. That was a kind of wealth that no bank account could ever hold. The years passed quietly. Arthur grew a little older, a little slower, but his routine never changed. Mr. Croft's business continued to do well, but he was home more often. He started dating a kind woman who loved the garden, and eventually they married. The big house was no longer a silent monument, but a home filled with laughter and life. Arthur, to his surprise and quiet joy, was treated as part of the family. He was not just the help. He was Arthur, the quiet man who kept everything running smoothly, the man who had been there through the darkest times. He never told anyone the story of the note. It was his secret and Mr. Croft's. It was a private understanding between them, a foundational stone of the new life that had been built from the ashes of the old one. One spring day, many years later, Arthur was sitting on a bench in the garden, enjoying the sun on his face. He was retired now, but the family had insisted he stay in his room in the house. "This is your home," they had told him, and it was. Mr. Croft, his own hair now gray, came and sat beside him. They sat in a comfortable silence, watching the bees buzz around the flower beds. "The orchids are blooming again," Mr. Croft said after a while. Arthur smiled. "They always do." He looked out at the beautiful, peaceful garden, at the house that was now a home, and he thought about his long journey. He had come here as a quiet man, looking for a simple job and a quiet place to live. He had found so much more. He had learned that the biggest problems in life are not always solved with money or power. Sometimes they are solved with a simple act of kindness, a moment of seeing another person's pain, a shared look, a clean mug, a few words written on a piece of paper. He had saved a fortune without ever meaning to. But more importantly, he had saved a man. And in doing so, he had found a family and a peace he had never dreamed possible. The world was full of noise and complexity, but in the end, the most powerful things were often the simplest. The sun was out, the orchids were blooming, and for Arthur that was more than enough.